Welcome, everyone. We've got Peter Borsella, Brian Levy, and yours truly, Ernesto Custodio. We could not have the full team here today, but the three of us are excited to be a part of the conversation. And today we thought, hey, why not talk about some of the practical parts that we deal with on an everyday basis when we're implementing or working on a transformation for an organization to become agile. And one of those, Peter and I were recently touching base, and we came across the what do we do with bugs in Scrum? Do we estimate them? How do we bring them into the sprint? The Scrum guy is pretty generic about the approach when it comes to product backlog items. They're all product backlog items as they should be treated, but there are some considerations when it comes to bugs. So we thought, hey, that's a great subject to discuss and bring back to the community. So without further ado, Peter, could I ask, how do you normally work with bugs in a Scrum team, or even multiple Scrum teams in a scaling setup?
Yeah, and there might be some variations, right? But let's look at some of the basic things first. First of all, I appreciate your acknowledgement. It's all work, right? It all has to be prioritized. So we're not talking about Sev 1 type things, severity 1 type things where everybody drop what they're doing. That's a whole different discussion, right? We're talking about a defect that is found after we've delivered, right? It's not within the sprint, because you got to fix what you messed up in the sprint. We're talking about sometime after, when you've completed something, you said it was done. Maybe it's even in production if it's software, and then there's a bug that gets reported. Right?
And some teams have a different language for that scenario, right? Some teams call the bugs, those are the ones that are found in the wild, if you will, whereas defects are things that are found before they're released, right?
Right. So yeah, bugs. I like that, in the wild thing. So we are talking about the case where we find something, or something gets reported to us after we completed the work on it.
So what does it mean, completed the work? Are we talking when they've been released? What about an item that we finished the sprint, we're done, hasn't been released, but it got kicked back before it was released? Now it's coming back into the sprint, but it wasn't discovered by a client, it wasn't discovered by support. It's still part of that cycle, if you will, because it hasn't been released. How do we categorize that?
This is great, right? Because we have to set the parameters of what we're even talking about, right? So let me, and again, we might all have different views on this, right? So here's my argument. My argument is that when the team says they are done with a request, which should be before the sprint is over, once they say they're done with it, we have the sprint review. From that point forward, I would view anything that comes up as what I would call a bug, or in the wild, right? Because the team, hey, whether it's in production or it's in pre-production or the customer's playing with it, no matter where it is, from the team's perspective, it's
right
out there.
On. We are on the same page and completely agree. There are two main categories: those that are found within the sprint and those that are after we said we were done, meaning they're past the sprint, regardless of whether they're in production or whether they're still internal.
Yeah, so maybe we need a new term. Maybe it's like post-done defects versus.
Are we talking about done?
Oh no, that's a whole nother session about that. So that's the set. Brian, we'll agree that's the setup, that's the parameters around the type of work we're talking about here.
So I want to say yes, but I also want to throw out a slightly different view. For me, everything is, if I have an existing something, anything that comes up is just an addition or a change to what already exists. So we can throw the labels on it, but I really don't care that much. I'm going to treat it the same.
Oh, okay. So that raises a question. And Ernesto, we may never get to the topic that you brought up, right? Because we need to talk about definitions first. So Brian, tell us more about, is there a distinction for you then for a problem that is found within the sprint? We're working on it and we find a problem within the sprint versus we find it afterwards outside the sprint.
So within the sprint, I'm agreeing to exactly what you're saying. You're working on something within the sprint. It has acceptance criteria. If it doesn't meet the acceptance criteria, it's not done, and you need to fix it.
Right then and there.
So I still don't call it a defect, right? You just fix it.
Right then and there, you fix it. So I see Ernesto nodding his head. So I think we agree on that. Now, Brian.
I do have a question on that. I will agree and not ask the question, but put a quick earmark on that so that you may continue in your questioning, Peter.
Oh, okay. Now, what about something that you completed in the sprint, and then 3 sprints from now, you get a ticket saying, hey, that thing that you worked on 3 sprints ago, it actually doesn't work. It's got a problem. That's the type of bug, if you will, right, that I was trying to put some parameters around. And Brian, you said, well, it's kind of all the same. I see that different though. So explain more about how you view that situation as it's all got to get done anyway.
That each sprint, you're trying to modify what you have. So you have a current state that the system is in, and you have a future state in which you want to get to, right? And I'm trying to get closer and closer to that future state. Anything that I notice that is a deviation or work that needs to get done to get me to that future state gets in the backlog, and I should have prioritized it. Now, I think that we classify things a certain way so we can make rules about it. And I do think that in a scaled organization, as part of backlog prioritization, as part of that component, you should define the rules for the different scenarios of items that weren't done, and what you do with them. But whether I call it a defect or whatever, you should define that rule at the scale level, and then the organization should just follow it.
Brian, I think that's what Ernesto is really asking. What are the rules, if you will, that we should be considering? So, my argument is there's a rule, if you will, because we don't want too many rules, but there's a rule that says, hey, if you're working on something in a sprint and you find a problem with it, you need to fix it in the sprint. Because that's one type of problem. The other type of problem is we get a report about something broken after we said it was complete, but we've already planned out the work of this sprint. And we've already used up our buffer time that we reserve for the unexpected things. So those things that are surprising us, first step, my argument is the rule would be, if it's not a all hands on deck, drop everything, it goes in the product backlog and it has to be prioritized.
I have the same rule with one important caveat. I firmly believe that the difference in Scrum and Agile is that we guide everything by customer expectations. And when I'm scaling Scrum, I actually want to do some scale demos, some validation with customers to figure out what they really care about, what they really want. If I find that this item that's not done, will actually skew the feedback that I would actually receive from customers. In other words, I want feedback on X, but this thing that doesn't work properly is annoying, and they concentrate on that instead of giving me the feedback that I want. If it's going to actually interrupt the feedback from customers, I better do it immediately, so I can actually get the valid feedback, get the right evidence to know I'm actually building things the right way for my customers.
See, to me, Brian, that sounds like it's a product backlog item, just like anything else, right? If there's a reported bug, but it's not really even annoyance, it's like something going on in the background, the customer doesn't know or care about it, it's something we are more concerned about, then that might get lower priority than the new thing that the customer wants to see us deliver. And if the team has a limited amount of capacity, and then the product owner has to make a decision, right? They might deprioritize a reported bug from the customer in favor of giving them something that's going to generate more value for them.
Absolutely. And I'll go a step further. It could be that I want to do this demo, and I thought about something else that would be necessary to get the customer validation, and I could decide that that's more important than fixing this item to get the customer feedback. So I prioritize that. So you're exactly right? I add it to the backlog, and I should have some rules over how I prioritize. I tend to sway the rules toward getting the right feedback for customer validation.
So where did we disagree, Brian? You said you saw things slightly differently, or somewhat differently. I'm not hearing us disagreeing on anything yet.
Yeah, well, I don't think that we disagree. When I said we saw it differently, I'm not looking at this world of bugs and defects. I'm looking at this world of, here are changes that I want to make in order to get the right feedback for customer validation.
Okay, so there's a distinction, Brian, right? So that's why I think we have to clearly distinguish in sprint problems found versus post-sprint problems found. Because when I hear your description of that, in general, I'm in agreement with you for things found after we said we were done with it later on. Right, but the stuff that's in the sprint that we find in the sprint, I view that completely differently. Those don't get prioritized. The product owner doesn't have to make a call between, fixing that or not. It's like, no, that's part of delivering it, right?
That's right. If I order a glass of water and you give me the glass and it has no water in it, you kind of didn't fulfill my order to give me a glass of water. So yeah, you should just fulfill the order.
Yeah, I don't have to prioritize that. I already prioritized that. I already told you that was important, right? We're going to see that delivered right now.
Exactly.
So we're clear on in sprint defects found or items that need to be addressed to avoid the label, and that those items need to be addressed in the sprint, whether by the same individual or by additional different team members. The teams can swarm. They essentially get these items done to the best of their knowledge. This is done. By the way, we've been throwing out the term done, but for those that might not be familiar with that is a term that over the years has become somewhat of common language, and it's an anti-pattern. It's the idea that we're done, but there's still more things that we might need to do to it, such as maybe a regression testing. And until it passes that, we're not truly done. So we have done, which is at the end of the sprint, and then there might be a done, which is past the sprint and really ready. We don't want done, right? That's why we chuckle a little bit whenever we say done. Yeah. Some teams haven't even known to have done, right, Peter? Yeah. And Brian, so they're anti-patterns that can easily cascade off of that.
It's just that when you go to done, you have to add the musical quality, which is done. Yes. Yeah, and that's funny because it's an anti-pattern, which is serious business. But what was my response? I can't see Brian's face, but I'm giggling, about it, right? Because it's unfortunately an accepted anti-pattern, right?
People that might listen, we are recording, and Brian's coming in. He's got thin audio. Brian is on his way to the Football Hall of Fame, so he's got a really good reason not to be on camera and for him to be mobile. So we expect a recap and a review of the Hall of Fame when it's done.
Yeah, and what I was getting at is the interest of time, right? What I find fascinating about this discussion is you posed a question, Ernesto, and we spent almost all of our time setting the parameters, so is this going to be like a two-parter?
There's so much packed into it, right? And what I find interesting, in addition to that, it's not just how much is packed into such a simple thing that every team deals with in some way or another, even if you're not software. But certainly software teams deal with this on an everyday basis. And it's not talked about enough. It's just implied that you know how to do this, right? There's so much, right? We even mentioned the potential concept of a hardening sprint in there, an entire conversation that could take up another slot. There's the conversation of urgent versus not when something does come in, because we haven't gotten to the actual applications that different teams apply to this, or the different approaches that teams apply. What do you do as far as estimating the bugs, depending on which category they fall in? Or the defect. How does this affect velocity? There's so much packed into this and just not talked about enough. So completely agreeing with you, Peter. So knowing that we have the parameter set, we understand and align on items discovered during the sprint. They must be addressed during that sprint, and the items must be complete or done at the end of the sprint to the best of the team's ability. But there might be some things that are discovered after, simply because we don't know what we don't know. It wasn't that we weren't done. It was just, well, we didn't see that, right? And now that is back at our doorstep. So how do we treat those two? We have a minute or two, in fact, exactly 2 minutes. Why don't we, Peter, hear some of the approaches that you take?
Regarding approaches, so the hot one for me, right, is how do you plan to work on the bug in the sprint where it is prioritized? How do you estimate it? How do you task it? What does it do to velocity? Those are the things that I found to be the most sensitive. In some cases, because there's a variable nature to the bug, right? Like I'm not sure. So now that brings in research to the conversation also. So just to give you the short answer now, it's like, hey, plan it into the sprint as you would any other item. That's the short and easy answer. More details as we explore further.
You bring another parameter in, and I think this is going to have a part 2 and maybe even a 3 to the conversation, right? You implied the need to understand the environment, aka the tool that the team might be using, whether it's stickies on a board or whether it's Jira or something else, might also influence, and there are considerations in how the team treats that, right? The tool shouldn't determine the process, but the reality is that a lot of teams sometimes are challenged by the limitations they have with the media they're using, right? Brian, last thoughts from you on that end?
Yeah, I think that the answer to how we treat it may be slightly different per environment. And really what I want is that Metascrum, that group of people, this Metascrum team, to actually create those rules and then make sure that we're following, right? And we can go, probably in the next session, we'll go into details about some suggestions that could happen in different scenarios for what those rules are. But those rules have to be created and disseminated, right?
Yeah. So Ernesto, maybe a future conversation you can take note of is governance.
Oh my goodness. And there's another, right? And that topic is the idea of what are some suggested rules for how do we treat found defects or bugs in a Scrum setting, right? Now that we've understood the parameter and the difference between those, or aligned as far as the parameters and the definition of those terms, what are some of the common practices that we as coaches apply out there in the real world? So stay tuned for that in our part 2 of that conversation. All right, excellent. Gentlemen, thank you very much for the rich and always very interesting conversation. Dave Wickens couldn't be here today, but I'm sure he would love to take part in the next conversation. Brian, enjoy the Hall of Fame, and we look forward to hearing how that went.